I get questions all the time asking my thoughts on piracy and microtransactions and emulation, and a lot of these questions don't really have a black and white, at least not to everyone. And it's not something you should be ridiculed for no matter what answer you give, but I want to cover these gaming morals and get my stances on them and why I feel the way I do when it comes to these. The one I get most often is, what are your thoughts on microtransactions? Now this one is strange because I hear a lot of people say, well, if the game is free, then microtransactions are okay. But I disagree with that because far too many free games abuse the microtransaction mechanic, making gameplay impossible unless you upgrade your gear with real money, or you can't continue unless you fill your energy with gold or something equally as moronic. I think this is more of a game-by-game basis and the developer needs to be considered as well. Take a game like Team Fortress 2. The game is free, but it uses microtransactions in the form of loot drops. I don't have a problem with these kinds of microtransactions because the loot only affects you aesthetically. There is no pay-to-win loot, and you can take your loot and sell it on Steam. This creates an ecosystem that is beneficial to the consumer and the developer. See, servers cost money. If the game can fund itself through these microtransactions, then so be it. But Barry, CSGO isn't free. That's true, and this one is more of a gray area for me because again, the loot drops don't affect the gameplay in an unfair way. You don't have to open any of the crates, and though them putting microtransactions in the game does feel shady, the game has been out for quite some time and does well for itself to pay for its own servers. Now, before I said you gotta think about the developer, Team Fortress 2 and CSGO were developed by Valve. To be honest, Valve probably doesn't need to put microtransactions in their games to keep the servers up. They're one of the wealthiest game corporations out there, but just because they're wealthy, it doesn't mean they can't implement a smart business practice. If it was anti-consumer, then yes, screw them. But their microtransactions don't cause any harm to the consumer. This also applies to Blizzard. They have in the past released games that never had microtransactions to begin with, but incorporated them much later to keep the servers alive for their games. With the release of Overwatch, however, the game wasn't even a couple months old when the loot drops were incorporated. Well, Barry, didn't you just say that was okay? Well, there's another thing I'd like to take into consideration, and that is time. CSGO had been out for a year before loot drops were implemented. The intentions were pretty clear on that. When a game implements microtransactions after all the reviews are out and everyone bought the game based on those reviews, it feels a lot scummier. Now, I'm not saying Blizzard intentionally waited for the reviews to add the loot in, but when it comes to microtransactions, it's a case-by-case basis. Essentially, the microtransactions I cannot support are the ones like in GTA 5. GTA 5 is a great game, but the microtransactions are paid to win. This is legitimately scummy to me, and I'd rather hack the money in than pay for their in-game currency. Realistically, I'd just do missions for the money, but you catch my drift. Other games that lock powerful guns or better cars behind microtransactions are games I would never even think of purchasing no matter what the game was. And if a game came out and I purchased it and it incorporated these microtransactions later, I would try to refund the game or delete it. Now, I need to play devil's advocate before I move on. Games like Killing Floor 2 are amazing, but they have DLC gun skins, and I hate this. This game would benefit so well from Steam Workshop skins, and people make a ton of them for the game. Unfortunately though, the developers would prefer to sell that as DLC instead, so as much as I love the game, this is a huge negative. Again, it's just skins, so it doesn't make me want to rage on the game and quit playing, but it's still annoying. Secondly, we have emulation. When it comes to emulation, a lot of people mistake it as piracy. Maybe to you it is piracy, and there's nothing wrong with looking at it like that, but to me, when a game comes out and is locked to a certain platform, that developer is telling me they didn't want my money in the first place. Let's say there's an emulator for the newest console on the market, and an exclusive comes out on that console. I wouldn't feel bad about emulating that game. I really don't like exclusives at all, but as anti-consumer as exclusives are, the developer doesn't need to be punished every time, and if I really enjoyed the game or just feel generous, I may go out and buy a copy to support said developer. When it comes to older games like NES and even GameCube, I have no problem emulating the games. These games are almost impossible to find, and if you did find a copy, the money most likely wouldn't go to the developer anyway. Let's stop pretending for a minute that we aren't all gamers who like playing video games. We're not going to limit ourselves because of something so small. At least, I'm not going to, and I love emulation. Being able to play my old games again at higher resolutions and frame rates with content and graphics mods, it's a whole new experience, and I don't see any negative to that. Okay, let's talk about piracy. I really don't like piracy. I've never pirated a game, and I don't think there will ever be a time when I do. What I mean by this is, never has a game come out and I've gone out and torrented it. If I can't afford the game, I just won't buy it, or I'll wait until I have the money. However, I do not see any issue with pirating the game to test it out. There are pretty much no game demos anymore, and testing a video game really should be your right as a consumer. I have friends who will set a timer for 20 minutes, start it once they launch the game, and once the timer goes off, decide right then and there if they're going to buy it or not. And I don't see a problem with that. The other thing when it comes to piracy that I don't have an issue with is region-locked games. I don't know why in this day and age a game would be region-locked, but it still happens. If a game is region-locked in China or Japan or America and you want to play that game, same thoughts I have on exclusives. If they're being anti-consumer, I'll just be a bad consumer. The last gaming moral I personally have involves online key stores. I don't have a problem with key stores. In fact, I kind of like them. When there's a developer that I don't want to support or actually really dislike, I have purchased their game from a key store. See, the thing about these key stores is, yes, they offer more options to the consumer, but they can actually hurt the developer. A lot of codes on key stores are stolen through credit fraud, meaning that the company was ripped off, and the game is sold for much cheaper. Now, there are definitely legitimate keys on these key stores, but if a game company releases a half-baked game, or fills it with microtransactions, and I for some reason still do decide to buy it, I will 9 times out of 10 buy it from a key store. Maybe the key I bought was legit, and maybe someone did acquire it legally, but I couldn't care less. Again, if you're going to be anti-consumer, I'm going to be a bad consumer. However, games I would never purchase from a key store are games that are made well, no microtransactions, released as a finished product, and I would almost never purchase an indie-developed game from a key store. Indie games are generally cheap already, and they could use that money for future products. I don't really care about a better deal when there's a legitimate chance I could screw over the poor developer here. Now, of course, a lot of you guys aren't going to agree with my decisions. A few of you may even think I'm a bit too extreme when it comes to some of the morals I have here, and there's nothing wrong with that because, again, these things are going to be situational, but it's good to have an insight as to how someone else would go about a certain situation. Maybe I do come down too hard on these companies at times, but then again, if you saw these corporations instilling anti-consumerism, would you be soft?